Thank you very much. It's again great to have everybody back, and again, it is my honor to introduce our next speaker. Mr. Owen West, as I said, is the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Special Operations Low Intensity Conflict. Previous to that, and I think he'll mention this, he's a bit of an outsider. He worked for Goldman Sachs as an energy trader for about 20 years in a very challenging, high-risk, volatile international markets of global natural gas and U.S. power. Mr. West did take 2 leaves of absence, though, and this is certainly of note, while he was at Goldman Sachs, and that was both to deploy to Iraq as a Marine. In 2003, he was a fire support officer for a force recon company, and in 2006, he deployed as an advisor to an Iraqi infantry battalion holding a remote outpost in Anbar province, where he led 12 soldiers with 500 Iraqi soldiers. Also of note, Mr. West and his wife have founded 2 cornerstone scholarships benefiting the children of fallen troops. He is also the author of several books about military affairs. One called Sharkman 6 won the Boyd Literary Award for Best Military Novel. He also wrote a book called The Snake Eaters, detailing the combat advisory mission in Iraq. He graduated from Harvard University cum laude, and then was joined the Marines, was commissioned in the Marines for 6 years as a platoon commander. He earned an MBA from Stanford prior to starting at Goldman Sachs. Ladies and gentlemen, ASD Solik, Mr. West.
Thanks very much. Oh, I didn't know we could pick our own song introduction like a reliever. I would have picked Metallica, but thanks very much, General Carlisle. I'm really relieved right now because, you know, I've got that feeling, you know, the feeling you have when you leave a biker bar and you forget that you left your credit card there, and then you wake up the next morning and it's in your pants and you just feel relieved. If you look at the SOFIC schedule right now, from 11 to 12 on SOFIC.org, it says lunch on Owen with a capital O. But my eyes are so bad after 20 years of trading, I thought it said lunch on Owen. And I was like, don't know how I'm going to explain this to my wife. But I want to thank the organization you lead, General, the NDAA. And I want to thank everyone here, because in an era when at our top companies we have petitions that are circulating objecting to working with the DoD, your patriotism is not lost on us. Everyone in this room, I think, sets an example for corporate America. So I thank you. I know that in this room we have both men and women who've walked point out on the battlefield and others who have supported for many, many years. So, you know, I understand now why you special operators call this a community. And in that regard, you know, I regard SOFIC as pretty special. I've already used 4 acronyms, and I don't like acronyms, but I'm back. And so I guess I've contributed to the military's 100-year war on the English language, but I do like nicknames. And special operators that strike me have the best nicknames. So thank you, Hawk. I want to give a shout out to T2, somewhere out there on a bicycle, riding, you know, for his leadership example in our partnership over the last year. And it strikes me that Rich Clark needs a really cool, cutting-edge nickname. And I think you guys have to do a better job than the one you gave your acquisition executive, Jim Smith, as a call sign. That falls pretty flat. So several of my predecessors have, in these remarks, called out many familiar faces, and I'm an outsider. So it's a good chance, I think, to get to know one another. When I got the job, my understanding of a special operation was trying to differentiate between the permanent press and the delicate setting on the dryer when tasked by the Home Secretary. But this is an innovation summit. There are disruption events. So I wanted to bring a little bit of how corporate America views disruption and true innovation into this room, just to set the stage for a follow-on discussion, specifically introducing a concept called the Innovator's Dilemma. Many are familiar with this here. These are not original thoughts. Once upon a time, I was an energy trader on Wall Street, as General Carlisle said, for 20 years. But I had very few original thoughts. I should also caveat it by saying I was wrong 40% of the time, so you can judge the rest of my remarks and throw out about half. But I did learn how to combine thought leadership streams for my own business in a manner that resembles today what we're trying to do, which is combine technological convergence to cause revolution. As head of natural gas and power trading, I made about 30 to 50 small decisions each day, about 5 to 10 what I'd call hefty trades per month, and 2 to 4 strategic decisions every year. If you've studied Boyd's OODA loop chart, you understand the basic business of futures trading. I could never make a decision if I wasn't 50% confident. If I waited to 90% confidence, the trade was gone. And then I'm in an arena with other competitors who are all trying to decide what the probabilities are and when to make the call. By the way, I'm going to be using slides today. You can cut, you shouldn't have my face up on those things. It's bad enough here. And if you're in the middle, if you can't see the slides, if your eyes are as bad as mine, you may want to begin to migrate to the flanks. We have some Marines here I see who could help you setting up the Marine gun section in terms of geometries of fire. So I put up on the slide here, this is a depiction of the Dow Jones in blue. It probably sits at 25,800 today. And against that, I took one of my markets. This is the New York power market. This is not the most volatile market that I traded. And we tried to get it on the same slide. In 15 years of the Dow, the greatest daily gains were about 13 to 14%. The biggest daily drops were 8%, which we saw during the mini recession we had in 08-09. In natural gas and power, we're about 20 times as volatile. So imagine that on our biggest days, with the Dow sitting where it is right now, by the end of the speech, the Dow going to 200,000. Imagine the worldwide chaos that would ensue, and then the Dow about a week later dropping to 12,000, or cutting its current value in half. These would happen in bunches about every 2 to 3 years. I'm going to put the scale now to show you what that looks like, just so we can visually represent it. On the bottom in blue is the daily volatility, so it's the same scale now instead of scale differentiated. And then you see the New York power market spiking 750% in a day. So after being thrashed by these markets for years, I back-tested my trades and realized that I may just go here. There we go, okay. And I realized that technological changes had accelerated beyond the point of prediction. So when I first started trading in '98, my basic idea was to get out as deep as I could against my competition. Sometimes that was 25 years out, and trade where Goldman Sachs had an institutional advantage. That curve began to shrink on me extremely rapidly, and I lost control in many respects of time. So I became fascinated with time change in all forms caused by technology. In 1998, I knew that 2 minutes of sunlight, for example, that hits the Earth, has enough energy to power everything on the Earth, and I mean everything, the automobiles, the grid, your iPhone, batteries, for 1 year. That meant nothing in 1998 because of the photovoltaic price curve. It was too expensive. By 2008, it meant very little still, I'd say. And by 2014, that statistic meant everything as we began to go green. Now this solar tech, to simplify it, in combination with battery tech, began to feed off of each other. So in 2014, we put out a report talking about the explosion in the internal combustion engines because of India and the Chinese. I mean, imagine, I know China, we recognize as our biggest competitor. 25 years ago, many of these mega cities today just had bicycles, and their acceleration has also gone parabolic. And so we, and looking at India, decided that we being our firm, that there was about to be an explosion in automobiles, and therefore that might drive fossil fuels and then eventually drive gasoline. 2 years later, that idea was dead, and the death of the internal combustion engine was predicted, I think now I'd say 2030. I'm a little bit more conservative than many of the leading folks out there in predicting that. Again, that's not my prediction. So I came to believe that the single most important graphical depiction of the rate of change was Moore's law. Gordon Moore was the co-founder of Intel, of course, and in 1965, I'm going to simplify the theory, he basically said that processing power would double every 2 years and costs would get cheaper. What's inspirational about this graph to me is not that Moore's law has remained remarkably accurate, even back-tested another 60 years to the age of mechanical and vacuum tube systems, but that when I looked at it in a different way and trying to understand my own world, I realized that this is just put into a log normal scale so that we humans can understand it. You see, when we think of the number of transistors that are put on a circuit board, back in the time of Moore's law, to give you now some fuller understanding of what I'm talking about, those transistors, if each one, say, represented an inch, now, of course, they're measured in nanobytes or whatever, but basically the top plot in terms of the number of transistors on an integrated circuit would have reached the ceiling maybe a little bit above, and today it's almost to the moon. And so this was really intriguing to me, but also really vexing to me because it was still outside my linear understanding. Another way of putting this is, and as Moore has put it for simple grunts, at the outset of his theory, about 10 years ago, if you had started doing this disruption in the automobile industry, Lamborghinis would now get multi-millions of miles per gallon, and that you would just buy a new one instead of paying for parking, and on and on. So, I put this now, and it took a long time to find this, because these depictions, again, begin to warp time, but I think it's very important when we talk about scale to understand that there's something going on that we do not yet understand. Here is the depiction of slope on a linear scale of what's happening in terms of computing power. So at 2018, we think we are sitting at the top of the parabola, right? And we're just going vertical and there's not much more that can happen. But 9 years from now, the top right point being 2028, that little node in red, my eyes again are bad, being 2018, we're going to look back at this time and say that from 2018 to 2020, that was like the 5 centuries or 10 centuries of the Dark Ages. Nothing really happened then. Now, in 2028, if this accelerant continues, is where the real action is. So how we see things, in my judgment, as a decision maker, is really critical to making the best decisions. And that's why it surprised me when I came into the job that there wasn't a wide, say, cost-based risk management model. Notice I didn't say risk mitigation model, risk management model that was close to my business. And again, just to kind of conceptualize the scale we're talking about, because it's important to understand that we don't understand this. This is just a basic doubling of 2 to the 64th power. Now, Moore's law is almost halfway there to the 64th. And that, again, at the outset, doesn't seem like a lot. Indeed, you know, we're going to be there faster than we can imagine. But the fact is that that's 18 quintillion grains of rice to the 64th, and that's more than double the amount of sand on the planet. Another way to put this is IBM has just put 30 billion transistors on a fingernail-size chip. Now, what's so amazing, and this is obviously amazing to us, but we would all, especially the Marines, say, if you told me that was 3 million, I'd say it's amazing. 30 billion, sure, 80 billion, 300 trillion, I'd say it's amazing. Because it's just not accessible enough for us to understand it. And so I began to search for folks who would dumb scale and change down for the grunt. This is Tim Urban, author of the blog Wait But Why, and I think he does a very nice job at simplifying technological change so that we can start to understand it. And in his best series, he takes on AI. Spurk will go deeper into this tomorrow. I'm going to stay at the superficial level where I'm comfortable. So first he looks at scale. And you can see that we as human beings feel we're fairly superior to the chicken, and we allow for the fact that somewhere a couple of stairs above us, some machines can beat us in some logic games, like chess. But if we go to super intelligent AI, this is what it looks like. We're on like the 5th stair of the Empire State Building, staring up and squinting. The scale is so vast, we cannot conceive of the probabilistic outcomes. Then Urban looks at uppercase delta, which is really just another way of saying rate of change. Here's a human looking down at the robot or AI or other intelligence. I'm putting this in a broad bucket. I'm not going to waste your time defining it. And the human, I think, is saying something like, I can't even read it, but like, isn't that cute? Look at the little robot that, Boston Dynamics or whomever has built that can jump onto a roof or perform monkey games. But the problem is we apply the lens of the last 5 or 50 years in terms of that rate of change forward. And even the futurists among us just bend the future outcomes a little bit. But if we were to take the same group and go back 50 years, those futurists would have well discounted the advances that we've had today. So this is a nice slide, and actually Liz Fu, there was a profanity up there, and she thought this group couldn't take the profanity. But you can see the human beings where superintelligence has just bent and cut right through them, and everything feels sudden. For example, I don't know if you remember the time before email. In the Marines, we got it like 5 years late. But all of a sudden, the way we conceptualize it is we had email, then you went on AOL, then your friends did, and suddenly you just took your old letters or your video camera, these other technologies that were totally disrupted and totally displaced, and put them in the attic. That's how we conceive of change. But the change and the paradigm shifts are coming more and more rapidly. In other words, we're starting to climb that exponential curve. And so the time to leap ratios are getting much tighter. So in my old business, where we used to trade out 20 years, we cannot do that anymore because the technological shifts, if I rewind and look at our prediction, for instance, on fracking, which is actually an old technology, it's just our capital markets and our entrepreneurial bent fired up this business in a way that the world didn't expect. Solar disruption, some green, some government supported or others. Battery tech, the fact that we have a single individual in a single company who, in our judgment, was able to strip $50 per megawatt hour off the cost of the battery just because we had the entrepreneurial system that fostered a Tesla. And so these future breakthroughs where, we began to trade 10 years and then 5 years, and I know I couldn't assemble a team in under 2 years, so my sweet spot was kind of 2 years to 5 years, knowing that by year 7, the technology is going to shift so much, if we put too much capital out there, it would just be set on fire. And by the way, I told Dave once, I tried an experiment with AI many years ago, and I might as well have taken $30 million here, set it on fire, and doused it with chicken blood. And so it was a pretty amazing experiment. I'm not saying, well, actually, it shouldn't have been done. But my view of this is colored because when we look back on that experiment, it's not so much that we failed in terms of the calculation or to run the script or the algo. It's that we didn't prepare for the right market, which is so basic, and it's not something we should get wrong. So this brings me to the law of accelerating returns by Ray Kurzweil. And I'll explain this simply. His argument is that complex systems have begun to shift exponentially, building on a series of related breakthroughs. And so this is like technological compound interest on steroids. Change comes more and more rapidly, and Kurzweil believes the rate of change in the 21st century will exceed that it's achieved in the 20th century by 1,000%. And in the 2 years since announcing this theory, or I should say that since the blog started to popularize this theory, it's actually a little bit ahead of that. And I think there's one important exception to the revolution and advancement, and that may be rock and roll. My son has been home sick, so I tasked him with an empirical study of whether I'm like someone born in 1917, looking at the Beatles in 1966 and sounding the alarm, or does today's rock and roll really suck and we're going nowhere? And he came back to me and said, Dad, today's rock and roll really sucks. So I'm hopeful that the Silicon Valley obsession, the new obsession, by the way, is on longevity. And again, there are tremendous impacts there. I don't want to go down this stream, but kids born now may live till they're 100. And I just hope the experiment on Springsteen and Jimmy Page, or that our robot masters will reinvigorate this genre. But the prac-app of tech convergence in my own former business was best described by Stanford professor Tony Seba in 2016 when he predicted the total disruption of the energy markets by clean tech. Tony has several excellent presentations that are worth your time. In his best, he leads with a depiction of New York City in 1900, which is overrun with horse-drawn carriages. And then a dozen years later, there's not a horse to be seen. This was considered radical because of the internal combustion engine back then. But I found one of his ancillary findings just as compelling. And that is, it's usually the insiders, the market experts, the market leaders who reject the revolution at first. As good as Steve Ballmer was in leading Microsoft after the departure of Bill Gates, he said in 2017, and I quote, "The iPhone had no chance to gain significant market share, none. In many cases, the first spark of revolution will come from within our own businesses, only to be snuffed out by territorial bureaucracy." As Tony Seba puts it, why do smart organizations fail to embrace disruptions that they are uniquely qualified to lead? This is Steve Sasson. Steve invented the first digital camera while working at Kodak. Kodak didn't believe in the idea. Its business was booming. They had 90% market share of the film market. And so in 2000, and if you were to draw like the customer acquisition curve, when digital cameras were passed from like kind of the innovative fanatics who not only stand in line out front of outside the Apple store, but they already have the iPhone 8 weeks ago from an insider in the supply chain. When it was passed from them to the early adopters, Kodak had its record year. And in 12 years, Kodak was out of business by its own product, or a product that was invented within the house. And so 15 years ago, according to legend, SOF had its own Steve Sasson. Fortunately for the country, Chuck Yeary's basic idea, sketched on the napkin above, was relentlessly pursued. How much of this story is legend, in my judgment, is unimportant. I'm a Marine. We were founded at the Tons Tavern over a beer. What's important is the idea generation and the openness the enterprise was, and then its ability to take our surveillance strike capability and develop it into one of the greatest operational advantages we enjoy today. This was due to relentless innovation by this enterprise, which tied together several technologies and concepts and then pioneered a breakthrough phase. In retrospect, this looks very much like a classic business revolution, a convergence of tech and ideas to take on customers in an entirely different way with a classic S-curve of innovation you see there in the blue. I'm just going to back up for a second, not to get ahead of myself. So in simple terms, the Special Operations Enterprise solved a really tough problem really quickly. Problem solving is a core capability of this enterprise. But if that is true, and believe me it is, a key business question is then raised. Once a problem has been solved, and the line of effort moves into the iteration sustainment phase, when should it be shifted to an enterprise better suited to either scale the business or just so that the problem solvers can move on to the next wicked problem, as was described by one of the terrific folks I had working for me last year. So this question of transition must be periodically examined across the SOF enterprise and not just in one discrete capability. After experiencing firsthand the clean tech revolution from 2010 to 17, as a civilian, I predicted that some of the same technologies would eventually lead us to transcontinental solar-powered drones, and then eventually that those drones were going to come overseas within 5 years, and then they would be very cheap, about $10,000, the conversion of photovoltaic panels, battery tech, and then the classic fragmentation munition, and all the precision timing and guidance systems that we developed for the world that are now exploited. But I think closer to home and in examining my own business, I searched for a fuller explanation of Tony Seba's conclusion that it was territorial bureaucracy that snuffed out these great ideas, because that seemed fairly thin to me. And I thought it wasn't the only reason for the blind spot. And so this led me to the Harvard Business School professor Clayton Christensen and the Innovator's Dilemma. And it's a cautionary tale. He argues that successful companies will get pushed aside by disruptive tech unless managers recognize the overriding need to change and muster the political courage to do so. This might be a product, an operation, or the organizing construct of the company itself. This is not easy because any revolution is rife with failure. Christensen argues that innovation falls into two categories: sustainment and disruption. Sustainment is fast-paced. It's marked by constant iteration to meet the customer's needs. As the customer changes, our best companies change with it and add. The positive customer feedback loop and the real-time returns on investment make it very difficult to unhook from the sustainment phase. Disruption, on the other hand, is marked by defects, low initial return on investment, and slow pace, sometimes really slow pace. Disruption aims to meet the customers of the future in vastly superior fashion, a way few recognize today, and indeed a way that even the customer base does not foresee today. Usually this is a lost leader, and usually the parent organization eventually objects to the business tasked with disruption. So every business must be on the lookout for the hallmark of the innovator's dilemma, which are diminishing returns. This probably includes us if our enterprise is not transitioning faster than the exterior marketplace and its participants, many of which are playing by different rules. The enemy will eventually get lucky, and on some paradigm level, they'll put us into reactive mode. Transition is hard. The idea generation that turns out to be the easy part, especially given the massive advantage SOF has embedded in its entrepreneurial culture. As Drucker said, as Mattis has repeated, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So this group has a tremendous embedded advantage. But there are existing pathways. My favorite is something called adaptive leadership. This has been around for about 8 years. Professor Ron Heifetz and Marty Linsky of Harvard developed a framework for how to drive change within organizations. And this is where it gets really interesting. Based on their back-tested research of companies that were excellent at sustainment, and these are great companies with huge revenues, versus disruption, they found that most companies sustain, and then most of the leaders, and this is my term, are charismatic conformists. And I use the word conformist in the best way, meaning we know how to work inside a big organization without upsetting the balance. We look out for our people. We drive change near term. We drive iteration. We make sure that we're doing our job and we're accomplishing the mission. But in looking at companies that truly had changes along the way in backtesting, those leaders shared a common trait, and that is they upset people. As Linsky put it, adaptive leaders disturb and upset people at a rate the bureaucracy can just barely tolerate. Because obviously, if you get ahead of that curve, you're deemed ineffective and you can't change anything. So we have examples of adaptive leadership. Secretary Mattis founded the Close Combat Lethality Task Force. There were initial rumblings and objections over that. They have a great relationship with SOF because SOF is a natural pathfinder and has always developed, and you know this better than I do, both operational concepts and gear that were passed to the joint force. So in this model, it's akin to a skunk works within the department. Closer to home, Tony Thomas founded the Experimental Force, which has great promise and is certain to attract a lot of scrutiny because the force is always going to be at capacity and the end state of the experiment remains totally undefined. I label Tony as adaptive because indeed he upset the bureaucracy, as have many previous SOCOM commanders, as will Rich Clark, a fellow MBA, who is now driving this extraordinary command. Rich, we thank you in advance, and we are with you, not just your partners in SOLIC, but this community. As the bureaucratic barriers inevitably pop up, we must collectively put them down. In adaptive companies, of course, ideas have no rank, and that means the next breakthrough could come from anyone in this room. But you're going to have to solve the puzzle of achieving bureaucratic decibels and pitch yourselves, and that will require persistence. Change is revolutionary, and revolutions require committed, patriotic fanatics like you. So look, I look forward to our discussion, and I thank you.
Thanks, Mr. West. We really appreciate it.
Okay.
That was great. The questions will start coming up. I'm sure they're going to be fast and furious, but since I'm sitting on the stage, I'm going to take the opportunity to ask the first question.
Oh,
That's
okay. Sure, right on.
Because I can do that.
It's your house.
Because I'm here. It's all right, Rich. That's actually the more important person I need to make sure we're all right with. So you talked a bit about it, and it was fascinating. It was a great discussion. So along with that change, along with that being an adaptive leader, there are failures along the way. I mean, there's things, you talked your early AI experiment. There's failures along the way. So when you talked about risk management, failure versus risk mitigation, could you talk about how those are different and how you see them differently?
Sure. I mean, first, when you talk about operational risk, and I'm not going to talk too much about that because mine is not an operational job. That's obviously, the underpinning is vastly different when you're talking about lives at stake. And so, a 40% failure rate would be totally unacceptable on the front. Now, in terms of R&D or investment, and I think the basic question is, and I see some stuff about budgets already, how much does this enterprise allocate toward CapEx or risk capital, whatever we want to call it, knowing full well that these streams may go nowhere, but have the intention of building up other technologies we can't yet foresee.
Right.
I must say that I don't often encounter opportunity costs or the risk of inaction, just in terms of the general vernacular that we employ. But that's commonplace in the Fortune 500.
Right.
The cost of inaction.
Right. And I agree with you 1,000%. The challenge, I think, sometimes I know Jim Smith faces and Hondo Gertz and Will Roper and that whole crowd is that you talked about kind of hindsight bias, looking backwards. You miss things that are going to, obviously, I think that's a great point, but it's also hindsight oversight. Somebody down the road 10 years will go, well, you guys didn't put enough of this into this particular program. They know that now, but they didn't then, whether it's IG, GAO.
Oh, yeah, no, we call that back trading.
Yeah, exactly.
Where your boss comes up to you and say, Wes, are you kidding? How'd you miss this? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So. All right, so we have some, should I read out some of the questions?
Yeah, please, sir.
I'm sorry, I'm just pausing to read in terms of what would or delight the audience most, or these are actually rated?
The number on the right there represents how many people have voted to get the answer for that
Oh,
question.
got it.
So
Okay, so
top
how does the budget cycle hinder the ability to innovate? What one change would benefit DoD the most? That's a really good question. I must say that having lived through, I guess, probably 1.5 budget cycles, if we go back to the NDS, which I believe is a superior document, if you compare the NDS to other quadrennial defense reviews or other defense strategies, in my judgment, the pathway is clear, and then the pathway for special operations is also fairly clear. But what is left out of that document, which you'd find, and it holds up among the best corporate strategic documents I've ever read, but what is missing is the capital allocation. And so it's been really interesting to me to see that although we have the same goal, the interpretation is vastly different for how we want to spend the monies. So what change would benefit the most? In my judgment, and I hate to go hierarchical here, but I would have an investment committee, and that's partly the role of CAPE, do a lot of the allocation. I'm not a budget expert, so I apologize for the platitudes, but I think, again, lacking specific programmatic guidance, we see the results of interpretation.
I think that leads to the question, and again, I'm going to take the opportunity here while you decide which next question you want to answer is, SOCOM is very good at it because they have a joint force, they have 4 component commanders, and they have acquisition and resource authority. If you go to OSD, most of the money resides in the services, which doesn't necessarily foster that same kind of joint and change solutions that sometimes SOCOM gets with the way they manage their budget in MFP 11. So.
Yeah, I mean, I must say it's been, watching Smith and the other executives in the command, I mean, it's been very impressive. Yeah. SOF is one domain where international coalitions are particularly crucial. What do you expect from your international partners and allies in industry? That's an interesting question. Let me take the first one because I do think it is what in the core competencies, and probably the original core competency of SOF, is building allies and partnerships. And especially when you look at the undulations in politics that are taking place today, there is an international bedrock of relationships, whether it be the Philippines, Indonesia, et cetera, which are military to military, and it's very impressive because a lot of those folks are right here in this room, holding everything together. In terms of partners in industry, this is again an area where my education is fairly thin. I mean, the partnership to me seems very natural and palpable when you're in groups like this, as I said. But you talk about risk, there's kind of the enterprise risk of those of us who are customers with money to spend on gear upstairs. And I notice most of the guys with the camelbacks congregate around the rifles, which is cool. And then there's the question of risk for all of you who run companies in terms of taking signals from this command, from the NDS, from the priorities that Rich Clark laid out yesterday, and risking some of your own capital to something perhaps that you cannot yet foresee. I find that really interesting when I look at the defense industry writ large. And one of the personal examples that I've been vexed by is the fact that the Chinese now have the clear lead in the consumer drone market, where really all of those technologies should have been ours, and some United States company really missed.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think one of the challenges...
we have, what is your vision for unmanned systems in SOF? That question's so specific, and again, it's fairly operational. When I look at my own role, I think it's a little bit akin to a board. Sometimes the board has to be activist, but that often is not very effective. But on operational questions, I don't think you would want a political appointee who's going to be here a couple of years coming in and saying that this is where we have to be on a very specific line of effort on unmanned systems. stepping back from that in terms of integrating a future operational concept, absolutely, I would be happy to draw on a napkin, but I'm not sure how much people would get out of that answer. Boy, I can't answer the second one either. Do you anticipate a year-long CRA next year? Are you concerned about sequestration? Again, I don't want to waste the audience's time with platitudes. How does the budget's like, okay, how can we keep our allies along with us in such a rapidly changing tech environment? Yeah, this is a really interesting question if we just, again, flip back to the corporate world, because, of course, we subsidize so many of our allies, but at the heart of every relationship is a quid pro quo, whether that's at the ODA level in an austere environment or when you're talking about actual diplomatic relationships. I would say it stuns me that I better be careful, this is open. I think the basic question there, if we look at the soft concept of the idea of a network, a global human network, is to make sure that the bureaucracy at the top isn't making too many decisions that stifle our ability at the grassroots to bring these partners and allies along and quickly. What future tech gaps do you see as soft transitions from counter-VEO to fighting a near-peer threat? Yeah, that's really interesting. And this idea of transition, of course, has been out there. Part of what the National Defense Strategy says is, I think, to quote the public version, but essentially that surveillance strike must get cheaper and must become sustainable. So that we can begin to look at near peers. But as you heard Rich say yesterday, we also have been given priorities from the Secretary of Defense, and the number one priority is VEO. So I would actually recast that and say, what does the VEO fight? Something that, as Rich's old unit within the J5, the T2C2, concluded is largely out of our control when you're talking about a socioeconomic religious movement. How do we keep a lid on this thing and continue to do the terrific job, by the way, of protecting the United States as job number one in a sustainable fashion if we still see geographic growth? And so what technologies does that imply? And again, I think if I'm going to talk about big gaps there, those are pretty obvious, and the enterprise is moving to fill them. It's just that when you deal with again, sociology, it's a really difficult problem to solve. Yeah. In your assessment, does MARSOC have a future?
It's the second time that question's been asked, so I guess we're going to get another opinion here.
Yeah, no, I know where it comes from.
And ask
By God, they have the greatest future of anyone in the enterprise.
There you go.
Look, I think MARSOC punches well above its weight. Just factually and statistically, I think it's been welcomed by the command with very little friction. At least that's my perception, or was my perception as an outsider. I think initially, remember, most of the friction came from the Marine Corps itself. But as an insider, certainly MARSOC is part of the team. Industry doesn't want to start developing tech and capabilities for an organization to go away. I understand that. I understand that absolutely. One of the things, again, that is vexing about this job versus my last job are the leaks. And I'm troubled by the leaks because so many are false. Like, if you're going to leak, at least make sure it's accurate and have a Machiavellian aim.
There's an ulterior motive you got.
So I think I know where this comes from. I think MARSOC not only is here to stay, but given the diversity it offers the soft enterprise, I would hope for growth. Gary Pisano, Harvard professor, said, "Too little understanding of the difficult truths of sustained innovation." Was he talking about me? Maybe. How do you see COCOM's nurturing innovative culture? Yeah, that's a really good question. I'm not fully qualified to answer it. I will say that the organizational construct, of course, is a little bit flipped from what you see in Fortune 500. And what I mean by that is we have a current construct where you have corporate headquarters designing a product. And so let's use SOCOM as an example. You're trying to build the best ODA. And then that product is given over to a regional employment or sales organization. And so there's a natural gap there between those building the product and then how it's employed. And that took me a little while to get used to. But I don't understand well enough the COCOM innovation culture to answer the question. Again, from what I've seen, the COCOMs strike me as very innovative. And I think one of the basic tasks of our unit in SOLIC is to make sure the men and women on the battlefield get the answers they need, even if it's a no, much more quickly than we're doing it.
I would say that the SOCOM's a great example of an innovative culture. Obviously, we see it here. We've seen it throughout. The challenge the other COCOMs have is they don't have the resources. I mean, you can be innovative, but if you can't carry it through, they have to go back to the services. So I think the SOCOM's a good model with respect to innovative culture inside of a COCOM.
Indeed. But it's funny because I think Tony Thomas told me when he was at one of our elite units, I don't know if I'm allowed to say it, but I never know the rules around here with you guys. He used to think that JSOC had a little too much bureaucracy, and he got to JSOC and he was like, man, SOCOM just has way too much bureaucracy. And of course, he was the head of SOCOM, and that headquarters grew a little bit over the last 3 years. So, you always think that the hierarchy's a little too slow. But I can tell you in the building, again, this is just our basic task is to be responsive in SOLIC and set the conditions all the way downstream to those who are taking the risk on the battlefield.
So out of these left, you can pick your final question you'd like to answer, sir?
No, I get to pick them now.
Yeah.
Well, there are only 2 left. I'm not going to talk about SOLIC's greatest accomplishment. I mean, look, bluntly, I think the organization I have and the people in it are really good. I'm not sure how good I am. It takes a while to learn a job like this and be effective. And then there's so much hierarchy in the DoD. I think you've got to figure out what 1 or 2, maybe it's 3 lines of effort you're really going to focus the unit on to help U.S. SOCOM and to help the SOF enterprise. So, we got more popping up.
Okay, we'll give you one more, sir.
All right.
How about the 922, section 922? Is that?
922, I'm not sure that will interest this audience. 922 was a new law in place in the 2017 NDAA, which made clearer the roles and responsibilities of this office as an administrator, and placing it in the chain, SOLIC in the chain of command, reporting to SecDef on administrative matters, while we still report to the Undersecretary for Policy on policy matters. That, I think, more interesting is if SOF is the disruptive, charismatic conformist of the DoD. I'm not sure that SOF is all conformist, but I hear you. Why is it so poorly funded in R&D as a percentage of the DoD budget? So we get asked this, and I'm not sure, Rich, if you were asked by typically the HASC, we're asked this question: why does your R&D budget look so small, especially compared to, say, the Air Force, which I don't think the enterprise should be trying to achieve, but at 3.5%, that was a little low a few years ago, and it's up now. I think it's a good question. I think people should remember, though, that in terms of R&D, we have entire units that, in my judgment, really are doing R&D. And if we look at, say, the core capabilities or competencies of SOF, one of them is certainly the ability to problem solve and quickly. And so you won't find that in our R&D line, but that type of work stream is research and development.
Yes, sir.
And it's neat to see up close.
Yeah, it's great to watch the operators out there figuring out better ways to do things and fix things and make equipment better, so.
Yeah, but I think, you know, that's, I'd say, a core competency. I was going to say I would differentiate that from a comparative advantage when you compare that to the enemy or to, well, in our case, to the enemy. I would say there are two things. One is, again, probably the culture is the biggest differentiator, but I don't know what it's like in Spetsnaz or Mossad, so it's hard for me to judge. I do think the biggest comparative advantage that this enterprise has is the NCO and Staff NCO Corps. One for one, it so outperforms the enemy. Of course, why we still have this antiquated system of requiring a college degree is left to some other debate. But tapping into that, from my perspective, if humans or the workforce is the comparative advantage, I think is something that's not lost, and I think we have to figure out how to harness that when we talk about this human network a little bit better.
Yes, sir. So we want to thank you for your time.
Thanks a
Great
lot.
comments,
Yeah.
and appreciate you answering the questions. It's great to have you here, sir.